The fourth time I found my mailbox in pieces, I stopped pretending it was a random accident. I stood there in the early light with coffee cooling in my hand, with splinters in the ditch, bills in the grass like confetti, and I felt that little click inside you get when petty nonsense is about to blow back hard on the person dishing it out. I live out on the curve where Sycamore Hollow turns past the creek and into Riverstone Meadows. Pretty name. Lots of rules. The kind of place where the HOA newsletter uses the word curated to describe the kind of rocks you're allowed to put around a maple tree. And lately we'd picked up a self-appointed guardian of order, a guy named Dale Mercer, reflective vest, zip-tied badge from a Halloween store, radio clipped to his belt like he's waiting on dispatch from Mars, clipboard full of violations he prints at home and hands out with a squint and a smile that never reaches his eyes. The first time my mailbox got hit, I blamed a delivery truck. The second time I wondered about bored teenagers. The third time I started really looking around, and I saw Dale's old gray pickup with a right bumper scarred down to primer. And there was this smear of dark green paint on the metal that looked a whole lot like the color I'd painted my new box. And I thought, what a small world. Neighbors had been whispering that I was on Dale's list because I've never been shy about asking why we pay for premium entry landscaping, but the entry looks like a vacant lot in February. And because I park my truck facing the wrong way in my own driveway, which, according to the bylaws, is a threat to community harmony. And yes, they really wrote that. But a mailbox mailbox, that's different. That's not taste or harmony or curated rocks. That's federal property. And the minute I remembered that, the anger sharpened into something clean, like the edge of a tool. I showed up to the next HOA meeting with pictures of my 3 busted boxes in a neat little row like mugshots, and I said, calm as I could, this keeps happening and I think it's targeted. And there was Dale in the folding chair along the wall, arms folded over his belly, that smirk that says he already knows how this ends. And there was our president, Roxanne Pike, robe queen on her porch at 6 a.m., executive blazer at 7, who treats Dale like he's the dog she feeds table scraps to, because he scares off raccoons. She gave me that patient smile people use on kids, and Dale said, maybe build one that doesn't fall over in a breeze, and a couple of his friends snickered, and I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I held it. I just held it, because I had an idea, and ideas need silence to stretch out and breathe. I went home and ordered a wildlife camera motion activated, infrared, the kind that catches coyotes at dusk, and I tucked it into the crepe myrtle, angled down the lane at the box. I slept like a kid on Christmas Eve all week. And then, on a Tuesday, 6:12 in the morning, there he came, Dale's gray pickup easing along the curb like it was stretching, and then the tiniest little twitch of the wheel, a casual nudge, and my box popped like a wishbone. He didn't even slow down. I watched it twice, 3 times, the way you watch a magic trick until the trick isn't magic anymore. It's just a guy palming a coin. The following meeting, I didn't make a speech, I didn't raise my voice, I just walked up to the projector and said, I'd like to show the board something. Roxanne blinked, Dale leaned back, and I pressed play. It was quiet in that room in the way rooms get quiet when a bunch of grown adults realize they've been pretending not to see what was right in front of them. When his plate filled the screen, custom vanity letters Dale is very proud of. Roxanne cleared her throat and started in with, well, videos can be misleading. And I left it paused on the frame where the letters were crisp as daylight and said, what part is misleading, exactly? Dale didn't look at me. He stared at the wall like maybe there was an exit there if he wanted it bad enough. If I believed the board would do the right thing, I would have stopped there, but faith and evidence are not the same, and I've lived enough years to know the difference. So I read every county PDF, every boring engineering spec on breakaway posts and rural delivery standards, every Q&A from Public Works about what counts as compliant, and I built something that looked ordinary from 20 feet, but wasn't ordinary at all. I set a steel core into the ground, legal diameter, legal height, encased it in decorative brick that was hollow where it needed to be and solid where it mattered, topped it with a heavy, USPS-approved locking box that wouldn't make a postal carrier swear at me under their breath, and I did it with my permits printed and paper-clipped, one set for the fridge, one for the glove box. My neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, came by with lemonade and said, upgrading, and I said, just making sure the mail gets where it's going. And we both smiled like people smile when something is only funny until it isn't. A week later, because bullies are patterns dressed up as people, I heard metal on brick from my kitchen, That sharp, ugly sound that makes your teeth hurt, followed by a hiss of steam and a string of words my mother would have washed my mouth for. I stepped outside and there was Dale's truck caved in at the nose like it had been chewing gravel, airbags drooping, hood smoking, his door flung open, and Dale himself bent over clutching his forearm and saying, "You set a trap. You lunatic. You set a trap." And I walked down the grass barefoot with my coffee and said, "You ran into my mailbox, Dale." And he shouted, "You made it illegal." And I said, "No, I made it to code." And then Roxanne's door flew open at the top of the street, and here she came in a silk robe and slippers, hair aloft like she'd wrestled a hair dryer in the dark. "This is entrapment," she yelled before she even got close. "You have created an unsafe condition and endangered residents." And I said, "Residents, singular." And she jabbed her finger toward my face and said, "You will be cited." And I lifted my phone and said, "Smile." And she paused mid-jab like she'd forgotten the world had cameras. Neighbors started to gather. Evan from 2 doors down, who's a retired mail carrier, Bethany with the stroller, a couple of teenagers pretending not to film, and Dale kept insisting I'd turned a mailbox into a weapon, which, for a man who'd been using his truck as one, had a certain poetic symmetry. It didn't take long for the county cruiser to roll in. Deputy Lynn, who's younger than the wrinkles on my work boots, but smart and careful and impossible to rattle. She looked at the box. She looked at my folder. She read my printouts. She measured the post like she takes no one's word for anything. Not mine, not Dale's, not a fancy letterhead. And then she glanced at the teenagers grinning behind their screens and said, "I'm going to need to look at that footage." Dale tried to interrupt, voice loud and that thin edge of panic cutting through the bluster. "He's targeting me. You should arrest him." And Deputy Lynn turned with that calm mom-teacher cop face and said, "Sir, please take a breath." While she called for a tow, while the paramedics looked at Dale's arm, while Roxanne tried to whisper arguments into the air like the air might sign off on them, Evan leaned close and said in the voice of a man who's delivered letters through divorces and holidays and summer thunderstorms, "People forget this is federal." And I nodded, and then Dale heard the word and went quiet. Federal. It sticks in your throat when you're used to pushing people around with paper notes and made-up authority. Deputy Lynn came back, wiped at her pen with a thumb, and said, "Sir, destroying or damaging a mailbox is a federal offense, and the evidence you're complaining about documents repeated incidents." And Roxanne tried. "But the box," and Lynn cut her off, "is compliant," she said, tapping my permit copies. "And I suggest the board stop confusing preference with law." Dale looked smaller then, not physically, just deflated, like a man who finds out the stage he's been playing on has a trapdoor and everyone else knew about it but him. He muttered that he'd talk to a lawyer, and I said, "Great. Bring your lawyer to the Public Works office too. They'll enjoy the field trip," which wasn't gracious, I'll admit, but sometimes you let a little steam out so the engine doesn't crack. They cuffed him because there's a point where paperwork turns into process and nobody's above it. Not me, not Dale, not the lady in the robe with a binder full of fines. The tow hooked up his truck, the airbags still drooling out like sad marshmallows. And as it pulled away, I looked at that new box of mine and felt something settle inside me. Not triumph exactly, more like a knot loosed after weeks of being tied too tight. Roxanne stood on the sidewalk glaring at me like I'd embarrassed her at prom, and I said, "Roxanne, you're welcome to file anything you like, but on this one you're wrong." And she pushed past me and hissed, "We'll see." Which is HOA for? I'm going to send a letter with words like notwithstanding. You'd think that would be the end. Guy hits mailbox, guy gets caught, guy gets charged, but communities don't work in straight lines. They move in spirals. They come back to themselves with new shadows on the ground. That night I got a message from Bethanish heard that Dale wasn't just doing this to me. That folks along the far side of the loop had lost boxes too. And some were afraid to say anything because their paint colors had never been approved. And I sat with that a while and felt my anger shift from a point to a field, wider and quieter, the way snow spreads across a lawn. 2 days later, I walked into the special executive session the board called to address recent events. They put out cookies on a plastic tray like sugar would make it easier. Roxanne cleared her throat and tried to stride through a statement about community standards, but the room wasn't with her. You could feel it. The teenagers were there in collared shirts. Mrs. Delgado had notes. Evan had brought an old postal handbook like a priest bringing scripture, and when they opened the floor, I said my piece in one long breath. How a rule about grass height doesn't give anybody the right to weaponize a truck. How power borrowed from the community means you owe the community a clean conscience. How I don't care if you love petunias or permit beige, but I do care if you use fear to move people around like furniture. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The room carried the voice of every neighbor who'd ever been relieved when they saw a cruiser turn down their street to help instead of harass. Someone asked if Roxanne had known about Dale's little morning routine, and she said no. And maybe that was true, or maybe it wasn't. But either way, something shifted where the chairs scraped the floor. We could all feel that thin layer of varnish the board had used to gloss over things start to come up under our feet. When it was over, after the votes to suspend Dale's volunteer enforcement role until the legal stuff shook out, after the motion to commission an outside review of compliance practices, after the tray of cookies sat untouched like a prop in the wrong play, I walked home under a sky the color of ash, and I thought about how conflict doesn't really change you in the big moments. It changes you in the small ones. In the way you decide to be civil when you could be cruel, in the way you keep paper copies and talk in full sentences, and bring lemonade instead of gasoline. I'm not a hero for building a stout mailbox. I'm a neighbor who got tired of being pushed and decided to push back with a tape measure and a statute. I wish I could tell you the story ended there with the credits rolling, Dale apologizing, Roxanne resigning, the board sending out a newsletter that said, "Hey, we're going to be human from now on." But the week after the meeting, I got a letter. It wasn't a fine. It was an agenda. Board proposes new guidelines for mailbox materials and aesthetics. No law cited, just aesthetic integrity. You can hear the new battles hiding inside those two words, can't you? The little knives wrapped in tissue, the way some people will always try to get back to the place where they felt big. And here's the truth, I might fight it. I might run for a seat and make them print my name next to motions that matter, or I might sell the house and find a place where creeks and trees don't require permission to exist. Or maybe I'll do what Evan suggested on my porch yesterday, sip coffee and start drafting a community bill of rights. Something simple, something like, we keep each other honest, we keep our hands to ourselves, we remember that rules are built to protect, not to punish. That's the whole ride. Start to where we are now, told as clean as I can tell it without varnish. And I'll leave you with this: if you've ever dealt with a neighborhood Napoleon, a board that forgot who it serves, a petty tyrant who mistook a clip-on radio for a crown, tell me what you did. Tell me what you wish you'd done. Tell me if I went too far or not far enough. Because I can see three forks in the road from here, and I'm curious which one you'd take. Drop your take in the comments. Who's right? Who's wrong? What does real community look like where you live? And if this story hit close to home, share it with that one neighbor who always waves even when you forget to bring the trash can in on time. Because that's where the good stuff starts. Right there, across the property line, with a little respect and a mailbox that finally, blessedly, stays standing.